Welcome, everyone. The music that you just heard is Backwater Blues by Bessie Smith, Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. Both of these songs wrote into history that was long silenced and obscured. Strange Fruit refers to lynching in the South, and at times both Holiday and Smith were attacked for talking about histories that were being silenced and ignored. Part of what we're doing today in this panel is to look at museums and memory, and music is a very important part of that, and how they attempt to write in history. And of course, in writing in history, they write it in from a specific perspective and viewpoint. Before we begin, my name is Joyce Apsel, and I'm pleased to say that I teach at NYU in New York, and even more pleased to say that in the academic year 2017-18, I have been teaching at NYU Florence. And I want to begin by thanking all of the people who helped make today possible, including Lucia Ferroni, Megan Metters, Marija, Luca, and others who make up this remarkable team, and it is remarkable, who put La Pietra Dialogues together. And to Ellen Toscana, whose generosity of spirit and incredible vision has made the La Pietra Dialogues and NYU in Florence a remarkable site and space for intellectual engagement for faculty and students, but also for the larger Florentine community. And finally, to our panelists, Amy Sidara, Davide Lombardo, Roy Tamashiro, who have come together to talk to us from very different perspectives, trained in very different ways, looking at museums and memory and difficult knowledge. So I'm going to begin my presentation talking about memory, history, and politics, and how they have become key themes in both public and academic discourse. And there is a memory boom during the last 3 decades of the 20th century that's going on to our own time. How can museums, and these are some of the questions that the panelists are looking at, how can museums provide a way to narrate difficult knowledge? Why is it important to remember and to provide spaces where visitors and people directly affected by terrible events can find both understanding and solace? How can such history and memory be passed on to next generations? What is the politics that is key to understanding how these museums are funded, how sometimes they are co-opted by those in power? Yet at the same time, the construction of sites of memory and history can provide meaningful emotional and intellectual experiences. What are the tensions, the contradictions? Who is the audience? To what degree are these sites of reconciliation? To what degree are these sites of contested history? In an age of this memory boom, these sites and the politics around them, and our panel today, will provide important insight into that. So I'd like to start today with the museum that calls itself a center, the Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia. This is the outside of the museum, and you can see the banner of Martin Luther King. This museum was proposed at the turn of the 20th century by civil rights activists like Andrew Young, who felt that there was a need to speak to a new generation and to find out, for them to find out in their own way how to connect with the history of the civil rights movement. This is the banner that one sees when one enters, because justice and themes of justice from around the world are the overarching idea of the museum. And the museum wants to inspire. It's a thematic museum. It doesn't have so many artifacts. It does have a rotating exhibit of archives of Martin Luther King Jr., but most of it is consisting of thematic exhibits. And here you see someone lifting up their hands that they're inspired and they're going to act for change. No, no, we are not satisfied and will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. This is the opening to the exhibit, quoting Martin Luther King from the Old Testament, from the prophet Amos. And Rolls Down Like Water is the most visited and best choreographed piece of this museum. There's an introduction to the 1950s urban South, the movement catches fire, freedom riders, March on Washington, 3 hymns, On That Day, the King assassination, and Requiem. As the CEO, Doug Shipman, said, how do you create a civil rights museum from scratch? And the founders and the board members over a number of years came together and had a series of different ideas that you'll see reflected in the exhibits. Those ideas included, we're going to call ourselves a center rather than a museum because we want people to come together. And I wouldn't be surprised if this week the center isn't coming together in honor of those who were killed in the latest shooting in Florida, a time when people feel a sense of the senselessness of violence and need a place to come together for dialogue. Another key idea was the idea of storytelling and of telling stories of people that are generally not known about and how young activists took a part in the civil rights movement. Another important feature came out of the creative director who was a director of the Public Theater for many years, George Wolfe. He said, you know, the civil rights story is a very dramatic story. It just hasn't been told in a dramatic way. So he used music, live footage, oral histories, video, television sets from the 1950s because television had just emerged. And this was a very important feature of getting across the civil rights movement throughout the US and throughout the world. And so together, thematically, they pulled these key ideas and key techniques about telling the history of the civil rights movement. One of the dilemmas is how do you give a public history of such a complicated movement? Do you go to contemporary sources that analyze it, or do you feature key themes and key figures? And they kind of commingled. They wrote in the history of women that was largely written out of the history of the civil rights movement. They added voices that generally aren't known. But at the same time, the figure of Martin Luther King Jr., this is in Atlanta, still is very, very important to the museum. And finally, they weren't able to be reflective about the civil rights movement, but instead they felt was important to balance the suffering, the struggle, and the violence with the resilience of the African American community. So here's the opening, and on the left and right, you see that in the 1950s, in the South, they were totally divided. People did the same thing. They joined sororities, they danced, they got married, etc., but within white society and black society. On the big panel in the center, segregationists, and next to that it says true stories, because many visitors couldn't believe that this is actually what went on in the United States at the time. And there you see the little television set, which again has live footage from the time. Segregation, laws and true stories. This was enforced in 12 southern states. These are called the Jim Crow laws. And you can move the dials on this upper panel and see the kinds of laws from African Americans not being allowed in public facilities, not being allowed to marry whites, not being able to swim in public pools. And then a whole series of features of elected officials, from the police commissioner to governors and senators. And George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who also ran for presidency of the United States, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Eugene Bull O'Connor, and also seeing the images in which the dogs were put on nonviolent protesters, send the dogs forth. One of the interesting things, I've been a number of times to this center, international visitors oftentimes say, I'm really surprised. I didn't think that this really went on to this extent in the US. And then one goes into a larger panel with a whole series of images and stories. And here you are just going to pull out two of them, and that is Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who was visiting relatives in the South, and he was accused of flirting with a woman who owned the grocery store. Her husband and the brother-in-law, 3 days later, the body was found. They killed him, and they beat him so badly that you couldn't see his face, recognize his face or his body. On the right-hand side, you see his mother, the image of his mother and him. And George Wolfe says, I decided not to show that open casket. I decided to show people what Mamie and Emmett Till were like together as a family. That image and Mamie Till's courage in not hiding what happened was very, very important in the 1950s in presenting to people the brutality and the anger of racism. And on the right, there are these panels of the accomplishments of the African American community in music and arts, and within their own community, for example, Auburn Avenue in Atlanta. So the idea is to juxtapose the brutality, but the resilience at the same time. This image is of Ruby Bridges. On the other side is the actual photo of her. Ruby Bridges was 6 years old when she walked to school in New Orleans, being the first African-American child to try to enter a public school after the desegregation of schools came down in Louisiana. What happened to Ruby, and this painting is by Norman Rockwell. And Norman Rockwell had an enormous conservative following, and it appeared in Look magazine. The name of it is The Problem We All Live With. And Ruby Bridges, as you can see in the background, nigger is written on the wall, tomatoes are thrown. And what the artist did is, because she had to be escorted by US Marshals, you see he cuts off their heads, and they provide a protective guard for her. He has her in white, even though she was wearing a gingham dress, again, a kind of purity, and showing the kind of deep racism which wouldn't allow Ruby to go to school. But in fact, Ruby did go for a whole year, but none of the teachers would agree, and none of the students would agree to be with her. So she sat with Barbara Henry, a teacher who came from Boston, by herself for an entire year. Again, through storytelling, trying to convey the depth of this separation and the depth of the harm it caused. And there are curriculum guides to many of these panels. And one of them, for example, in this case, says to children from 2nd to 5th grade, how would you feel being alone? How would you feel if no one wanted to join with you? What would you do? And then they reference Ruby's biography, and they take pieces from it and use it as an illustration, again, of this idea of resilience. These two are among the most popular exhibits. One is mugshots of the Freedom Riders. It's a model of a Freedom Rider bus. These were integrated groups, two people who came on buses and who tested the desegregation laws once they came down. In other words, the idea of being traveling interstate and being allowed to do so was now permitted. And in Anniston, Mississippi, and elsewhere, these buses were burned. Police looked the other way. One person was killed from it. And this is their stories, which you can hear on audios. To the left is probably the most popular exhibit, and that is a replica of a Woolworth lunch counter. Woolworth was a chain of 5 and 10s. Yes, you could buy things for 5 and 10 cents at one time in history. And there was, African Americans were not allowed to eat in these lunch counters. And once the laws came down that this was a violation of federal law, groups were trained in nonviolence, and these groups began to sit in and you can see the photo of the ketchup being thrown, shouted out. And the experiential piece of this is you can put your hands on the counter, put on the phones, and you can hear these epithets being said at you to get some small sense of the kind of discipline and the kind of courage it took to try to overturn these centuries of Jim Crow laws and practices. Here we have two leaders of the nonviolent civil rights movement, Fannie Lou Hamer, and there are a lot of people who were written in. James Lawson, last year, I and Martin Dinwiddie brought James Lawson, he's 89 years old, to NYU, and he conducted 3 nonviolent workshops for our students. James Lawson was the leading figure in nonviolent workshops. He originally refused to serve in the Korean War. He was sentenced to 3 years, served 1, and then he went to India. He was a conscientious objector. He learned more about Gandhian technique, and then he came back and he trained a whole generation of civil rights young people in particular on how to proceed, how what he calls the redemptive community can exist through nonviolent protest. And James Lawson points out that even though it's very difficult to hold on to this rule of do not do unto others what they do unto you, that is the centrality, he says, of Christianity and the centrality of the nonviolent movement. And still at 89 years old and outside Los Angeles, he continues to be an activist. Here you have another spectacle. It's quite amazing. You sit on that bench, so you can see the person there, and you can relive, to some degree, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And here again, some of history has been lost. There are lots of speakers beside Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. There are lots of entertainers, you can hear them. And there were lots of organizers, and in particular, there were organizers who at the time were not recognized because they were too left, because they were homosexual, etc. And so this gives a fuller history of what was going on. There's a photo up with J.F. Kennedy and the leaders of the march, and it's pointed out, of course, that originally Kennedy was very against this march, but once he saw that it was peaceful, he agreed to this photo opportunity and supported it. And so you have, again, a more full history where you can hear Odetta singing or Peter, Paul, and Mary singing, and you can get a sense. See that fellow right here facing us, Bayard Rustin, from a little Harlem office. He was one of the key people who really created this movement in terms of arranging and organizing. You can see movies of people pouring out of the buses, being told where to go. being told also where to pick up the signs were all ready, and how this was orchestrated in order to call attention not only to racial inequality, but to structural inequality, jobs, and freedom for all. From the high of the march, 3 weeks later, the court decision comes down that Birmingham schools can be desegregated, and 3 members of the Ku Klux Klan bomb the Baptist church, and 4 little girls, 11 to 14, whose names are up here, are killed at Sunday school. And again, the roller coaster and emotional nature of the civil rights movement going back and going forward over time. And the religious and hymnal elements in this, because that was a very important part of the civil rights movement, and the rubble. And you can hear the voice of Martin Luther King's eulogy with about 8,000 congregants coming in. And again, these images were flashed all over the nation and all over the world. And people increasingly realized the depth of injustice of segregation. Here you have a series of martyrs. Some you meet earlier on, like Emmett Till. Some you're just going to meet, like Martin Luther King, Jimmy Lee Jackson, 2 activists from Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, who are killed in Mississippi summer, trying to organize for voting. And there is a 6-week search for their bodies, and when their bodies are found, they have been mutilated. And this, again, further raises the consciousness of the need to support the civil rights movement and to undo the depth of racial segregation. By the way, Mississippi Summer began in Mississippi in part because 7% of African Americans were able to vote at that time, and they very much, the SNCC and others really wanted to get the votes of African Americans, their capacity to be citizens and to vote and to be elected. Here, again, from the moment in Washington when everything seemed to come together, to then the martyrs and the assassination of Martin Luther King. Here is the brother-in-law of the owner of the famous Lorraine Motel wiping off the blood. And on the bottom is a carpet filled with the flames of riots that took out afterward. On the TV screen, you have, from that moment, the live coverage of what happened. Quote, "The apostle of peace, Martin Luther King today, the man who advocated nonviolence, was shot. Police are looking for it, etc." So you have this kind of tension going on, demonstrating what the feeling was at the time. Then on another screen, Bobby Kennedy, that same night saying, "Yes, it is true." And we give our sympathy to the families of those of Martin Luther King Jr., but also we ask all of you to go home and to go home peacefully. On another monitor, the performer James Brown, singing through the night in Boston, singing and hoping by doing so that he can get the audience, a live concert, not to riot, and there wasn't a riot in Boston, and this was one of a number of factors of why. And then there's the photos and some actually archival material on the funeral, how it takes place, where it takes place, the fact that if on the one hand it was peaceful and thousands of people came, here's the wagon, and you can see Andrew Young, you can see Hosea Williams, you can see Jesse Jackson and others. If on the one hand, the idea being that the wagon was Martin Luther King's emphasis on jobs and on the common people, on the one hand, that the flag was flown at half-mast by the Atlanta mayor. The governor was sitting opposite that, and he had the state troopers prepared to march on the funeral if there was any disobedience. So these tensions are played out over and over again in this drama of civil rights. Outside of the museum, you have these arcs with writing on them from Nelson Mandela and from Margaret Mead. Trying to find the... For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. So the Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta has a very difficult history to portray. To some extent, the lack of internal criticism of the civil rights movement, the iconization that continues of leading figures is there. But within that, there is an extraordinary, I think, effective way to have visitors who come from very different background. From the Japanese visitor I met who said, I never knew the US was so racist. I never heard of Jim Crow, to those who have more background, that it presents very difficult history that very much continues with us. If W.E.B. Du Bois said that the question of the 20th century is the question of race, we can know that that question continues into our own time. Thank you very much.
So maybe we can have a little bit more light over here. Let's see if this works. Okay. So I will try to be short so that we... And I'm glad to see my students here and also some friends and colleagues. I want to thank, first of all, Joyce Apsel for inviting me in this panel and for what follows all the mistakes, both factual and conceptual. I am completely responsible, but I need to say I'm totally indebted for what I'm going to tell. A conversation with the director of the Museum of Deportation in Prato, Dr. Camilla Brunelli, and to the historian, one of the historians of the museum, Dr. Enrico Iozelli, that were so kind in sort of welcoming my curiosity about the museum and the institution and the practices that are around in that place that is very important in their life. So you see here the title, Bridging Memories. I kind of simplified the title that is on the new program, the Museum of Deportation in Prato and the twinning with Ebensee. Anyone knows where Ebensee is? It's a small village or a small town, you would say, probably in American, in Austria. The place where the concentration camp where people from Prato were deported. Now the two towns are twinned and there is an ongoing exchange. Now, I'm going to talk about that because I found some of the connection between some of my, besides my teaching interest, NYU Florence is modern Italy and urban history, and this is among the bridging, is my own bridging here. But there is a bridging between memories and centuries and dimensions, and I'm going to explore this, trying to focus on the interesting and the problematization of these things. So this is the upside, you see the logo of the museum, which is Museum and Center of Documentation of Deportation and Resistance in Prato. The logo is a red triangle that political prisoners had to wear in a German concentration camp during World War II. On top, the red triangle goes on top of the striped kind of jacket that you see there in the larger triangle. The museum is part exactly of what Joyce Apsel was defining a memory boom. It's founded in 2002, then it becomes a foundation, and it starts out of local memory to try to reach out to other dimensions of the memory, from the memory of political deportation in this small town near Florence, not so small actually, almost 180,000 inhabitants, to the memory of other deportations, Jewish deportation, Sinti deportation, Roma deportation, mentally challenged deportation, mentally homosexual, and so on. And so it's an attempt to outreach from that kind of cluster that is proper to the museum. Already there is another one, already in the name of the museum, there is one other bridging besides this. There is one between the memory of deportation and the memory of the resistance, which are two distinct things. One thing is the resistance in Italy to the let's say, fascist republic, the fall of let's say, fascism, properly said, in 1943, and the occupation of the Nazi, and one is the resistance. The other thing is the deportation. Already there is a certain distinct memory that is there is an attempt to bridge in this museum by the choosing of the site. The site is in a place outside Prato where there was an execution of the German retreating force of 29 partisans. And so by choosing that site, there is a specific attempt to connect the memory of the deportation to the memory of the resistance. And that I asked, was that problematic or wasn't problematic? And they said, well, it's all anti-fascist, and so that's the kind of overarching things that politically was used to justify that connection. In the museum you find quite a few objects that make the collection, and so you have here an oiler and a metal scoop used to clean the trucks that were used by wagons to carry out stones. Prisoners had to help the construction of tunnels that were to be used for the development of missiles for the Third Reich, then used for construction of tanks. So it's a kind of secret factory site. There is, this is a wooden hammer used to put clay into to seal the holes where the dynamites would be put to enlarge the tunnel. So there are objects like this, an original jacket. You can see the red triangle of the political prisoner with the IT of Italian put on top of the red and the number. The prisoner had to carry the numbers their number in 2 places, on the jacket and on a bracelet they had to wear all the time. So this is a syringe used to kill prisoners, terminate prisoners with an injection in the cardiac area with petrol. What is exceptional, I'll skip over. This is the display, but I'll skip over while I'm talking. This is already quite, let's say, not something that you find in every city as Museum of Deportation. While resistance is very well marked throughout the territory, deportation is less. So you need to go to Rome, where there is a Museum of Shoah. You can go to Milan, where there is a memorial in the train station. And there are various sites. There is in Turin, there is another museum, and in Carpi, there is another museum in the Fossoli camp, and another of some of the Italian camps, or the camps in Italy. But there is not much, let's say, south of the Apennines and north of Rome, so there is lots of schools that go to this museum. However, and this is the point, what is striking about this collection is that it's original, and where does it come from? In 1972, a group of ex-prisoners, of ex-deportees, took a car, went back to the camp, and took what they could find and brought it back in an act of self-therapy, group self-therapy, which is kind of a movie in itself, or a screenplay in itself. And this is already exceptional, and I started to say, well, there is kind of a story here that needs to be explored. How that happened, what brings people to do that. But then the second thing, which is exceptional, is this: these same people who did that were largely responsible to push institutions, the Prato, to twin with Ebensee, the village they had gone to take these things out, and were the village in Austria. So how? And this happens not during the memory boom, but in 1987. Now, if one thinks that it takes at least 10 years to push an institution to do anything like that, it means they start very much in the middle of the 70s, where these people are in their 50s, to start to think, how are we going to pass this memory over to the next generation, and start to think about the possibility of exchange with the place where that happened. It's quite remarkable. And it led me to sort of say, well, I need to understand a little bit more how all of that happened, and how can we reconstruct such an early, from one point of view, but quite, let's say, remarkable story, I would say. Do I need to stop? Tell me, do I have 2-3 minutes left or not? 2-3 minutes. I've said the central thing. I'll jump to some of the conclusions. There are a series of practices that are around this museum. There is, on the 8th of March, in a few days, every year there is a meeting in Piazza Santa Maria Novella, where the prisoners, the political prisoners, were gathered on the 8th of March, 1944, were taken to what is now the Museo del Novecento, the 20th century art museum, gathered there to then be taken to the train station, where there is a play, and sent over to Fossoli and then Mauthausen, where which was the head concentration camp where Ebensee was attached. And there are other practices, like the practice that I show in this picture, the stumbling stones. These are stones that are put in many places in Europe where people were arrested by Nazi or fascist authority. In the case of Prato, there are 40 of them around the city, and where 40 of the 130 people who were arrested in 1944 were taken by the fascist collaborationist with the Nazi authorities. And finally, here I'll probably finish here and cut even further. There is the twinning between Prato and Ebensee, which is really the result of a life work of one of the people, of one of these ex-deportees, this person in the picture, Roberto Castellani, who survived, was one of the 24th out of 250 or so that were deported from Prato, who came back, took on his shoulder the question of passing on the memory, the devotional practices of taking people, family members, to Ebensee to see the place where they dear died, and then pushed for this twinning. And there are interviews in which he says, well, it's important for school kids to go and see, but they also need to contribute economically, because otherwise it's only kind of a vacation. He had an entire kind of very strong point of view. And there is a plate remembering him in Ebensee, I put it there, as a special person that connects the two communities. So it's quite an exceptional stratification of things. I'll put it here. Was my sort of trying to map some of the rituals and dates and institutions that participate and are around the Museum of Deportation, part the site and the Association of Resistance, the Jewish community, and the train of 27th of January, the Day of Memory, to Auschwitz, the Association of Ex-Deportees, the ANED, and the March 8th anniversary deportation, the Stumbling Stones, the city of Ebensee, and these pilgrimage back and forth from Austria to Prato, and its three-layered kind of, the three layers of it. The devotional practices that started already in the 40s, so people going there and to visit the place and remember the place where the family members died. And then there is the business of the twinning, all the institutional kind of exchange, and finally the critical teaching of what happened. And in a way, this is the historical stratification of things, but in a way they are important, it's kind of switching over. And the critical teaching is becoming more important, the twinning is the business of twinning, and the devotional practices, of course, with the passing of time, are receding in the background. In the background. I stop here. I hope that I pass the kind of question of practices of memory, stratification of memory, individual and collective, institutional, and all the kind of the remarkable place that our museum is. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I guess I would like to start by thanking Joyce in particular for inviting me to be here, and my fellow panelists for their really fascinating presentations, and everybody here at La Pietra. It is such a special place, and I'm really delighted to be here. So I'm going to be taking us back to New York tonight, and I'll be focusing on memory politics in the National September 11th Memorial Museum. So the 9/11 Museum opened in 2014, and it's intended to be, and this is a quote from the website of the museum, the country's principal institution concerned with exploring the implications of the events of 9/11, documenting the impact of those events, and exploring 9/11's continuing significance. While the adjacent memorial, which is called Reflecting Absence, and it's these gigantic pools of water in the footprints of the Twin Towers, this memorial is really kind of meant to be a space for contemplation and remembrance, but the museum seeks to do much more. It's an exemplar of the increasingly popular global commemorative form of memorial museum, which is intended to be both a site of history and memory, but also a place for the promotion of human rights and peace and democracy in the aftermath of political violence. It's a museum of difficult knowledge that attempts to use this difficult knowledge to ethically transform its visitors. And in the words of Alice Greenwald, the director of the museum, it's intended to be an agent of resolve, demanding that each of us individually, nationally, and globally place a value on every human life. This reflects a contemporary normative demand that's been referred to as a politics of regret by Jeffrey Olick, or a cosmopolitan memory imperative by Daniel Levy and Nathan Schneider, that collectives today confront past violence in a way that's intended to help prevent it in the future. Museums and other institutions of memory have increasingly kind of taken up this demand, moving toward depicting, in the words of Roger Simon, a greater appreciation of the complexities, competing motivations, and potential for aggression inherent in human relationships. The 9/11 Museum also reflects the way that the contents and forms and practices of memory increasingly travel the globe, and there's striking similarities between the 9/11 Museum and other Holocaust and memorial museums around the world. With its focus on internationally agreed upon memorial museum best practices, in particular the privileging of individual stories and experiences in order to create an affective, experiential rendering of 9/11 that inspires empathy and ethical transformation, the memory in the museum appears to be unbound from national borders and political agendas, instead oriented toward universal ideals of human rights and democracy and peace. It's this kind of ethical transformation that Greenwald describes that the 9/11 Museum attempts through the 4 key principles that guided its design. The first of these is authenticity. The museum is on the site of the attacks, and it attempts to really kind of harness the authenticity of place to give the museum the moral authority to tell the story of 9/11. The second is engagement. It seeks to be a really interactive museum that draws the visitor into an experience of 9/11. One of the ways that it does this, probably the key way, it invites visitors into a recording studio in the museum where they can record their own memories of 9/11. The third principle is connection. Throughout the museum, there are many ways that it tries to inspire identification and connection between the visitor and the victims, but also the survivors and the families of the victims. And finally is its use of storytelling. It uses storytelling to convey the experience of 9/11 with the belief that, in the words of Alice Greenwald again, bearing witness to the unimaginable is the only way to imagine a way beyond it. And I'm going to focus a little bit on storytelling because in the 9/11 Museum, storytelling is different from in other memorial museums. September 11th was, as we know, a heavily mediated, recorded, and witnessed event. It was witnessed by an estimated 2 billion people around the globe. And so the museum designers realized that over half the world's population probably remembers where they were when 9/11 occurred, and decided to make a driving principle of the museum design the idea that individuals would tell the story of 9/11. So rather than memory complementing the historical narrative in the 9/11 Museum, the historical narrative is meant to be constructed out of individual memories. And I'm going to give just a couple of brief examples of how this is done in the museum. One very powerful way that individual memories kind of tell the story is found in an alcove. There are several alcoves of disturbing material that you kind of have to go out of your way to visit. And one of these focuses on the people who jumped to their deaths from the burning buildings. In this alcove, there are no explanatory or interpretive panels. There's one large still image of people jumping, of the bodies falling through the sky, and then there are several quotes on the walls, very sort of starkly printed on the walls. This is one of them, quotes from the people who witnessed this aspect of 9/11. So here, the museum is not interpreting, it's not explaining this aspect of the event, it's letting the witnesses tell this part of the story. Another way, and this is perhaps even more powerful, is the use of audio recordings throughout the museum. So the museum, like any museum, has documents and images and videos and artifacts, including, objects that belong to victims and survivors. But it's a highly auditory experience, and the soundtrack of the historic exhibit is this clamor of voices. There are witnesses and talking heads and screams and shouts and sirens. And one of the most powerful aspects of the audio in the museum is the sounds of the victims themselves and the voicemail messages that they left for their loved ones. Let me see. Okay, here's just one example. Is that working? Oh no, I'm sorry. It's not that important if it doesn't work. I don't know in this view. Sorry, it's okay if it doesn't work. Oh, thank you. Oh. Oh, the computer. Sorry, so you won't get to hear. But you can imagine, I think, what it is like to hear a voicemail message from one of the people who perished in 9/11, left for his wife on the answering machine, kind of telling her what was going on. So visit the museum if you get a chance, and then you'll have the chance to see the power of the audio. So this use of audio, of course, echoes the use of testimony in memorial museums, but in the 9/11 Museum, it's different because we actually have the voices of the victims, and that makes for this really profoundly moving experience. So this emphasis on individual stories and memories in constructing the national story and memory of 9/11 came out of a very principled set of concerns that the museum designers had about this daunting challenge that they were faced with. When they started the museum planning, it had only been 5 years since 9/11 occurred. The site, as you can all imagine, is symbolically but also commercially very valuable in New York City and in the country. And there were many, many stakeholders who had a real or perceived claim to the memory of 9/11. So it was this big, sort of daunting task to design this museum. And so the creators very carefully, trying to navigate this complex environment, attempted to avoid, as we see in the words here of Alice Greenwald again, grafting historical meaning onto the events because it was too soon and 9/11 was not yet over. And so rather than focusing on history, they chose to focus on memory and offering an individual experience of meaning making within a communal setting. They sought to avoid the construction of a hegemonic national narrative of 9/11 and instead look to the fragmentation of individual memory and experience to create a diversity of stories and encounters. So in this way, the museum's creators were seemingly adhering to some of the best practices of memorial museums, and also many notions today of how memory itself moves across and beyond borders and is traveling and is a process and is not a reified object that is solely the domain of the nation state. So the museum creators tried to capture this restless movement of memory, but as I will argue, by removing the historical and political context of the events, rather than remembering 9/11 apolitically, the museum actually becomes highly political. For while they were, trying to avoid historicizing 9/11, part of their mission as a museum was to give some historical context to the event. So in trying to navigate this tension between history telling and memory, the big question that emerged was, when did 9/11 begin and when did it end? The museum creators, in trying to kind of balance history and memory and politics and individual experiences, they chose a relatively narrow temporal focus. And in the museum, 9/11 essentially is the day itself. So began the moment the first plane hit the North Tower, ends at the end of the day with the rescue effort, but the historical exhibit really focuses on the 102 minutes of that morning, from the first plane hitting the first tower to the second tower collapsing. So the historical exhibit tells the story of those 102 minutes with a really sort of rigid timeline that tells visitors what was going on in the air, what was happening on the ground, and walks them through the minutes of that morning. The timeline kind of snakes through these very claustrophobic and cramped rooms, and visitors are just kind of assaulted with images of violence. There are videos and documents and artifacts and photographs, and as I've said, this soundtrack that takes visitors through the entire exhibit. So the timeline really kind of immerses the visitor in the minutes and hours of the day. And this multimedia cacophony really takes visitors into the experience. So they're kind of living through that morning with people who were there on 9/11. It's a really emotional journey. It's exhausting. It's traumatic. And it's only at the end where there's a little bit of historical contextualization. So after the 102 minutes of the day, there are a couple of small rooms focused on before 9/11 that look at the rise of Al-Qaeda and the hijackers. And there are a couple of rooms focused on after 9/11, which really focus on recovery and rebuilding, and one room that poses some kind of big lingering questions in the aftermath. But really, the focus of the museum is this emphasis on, the 102 minutes. So one of the problems with this, probably the biggest problem of this, is it depicts 9/11 as an event that occurred out of the blue. And the blue, of course, is the sky in this idiom. And this is a very frequent representational focus of 9/11, right, on that blue sky of that beautiful September morning. You're all probably a little familiar with this now, but this artwork, this memorial artwork in the exhibit, is composed of almost 3,000 shades of blue that represent the almost 3,000 victims of 9/11. So this is a frequent way of thinking about 9/11 as a rupture that occurred out of the blue, but it's also a way of remembering 9/11 while forgetting about its causes, right? With no contextualization, it's this kind of shocking rupture of time that has no cause, that has no precedent. And so, ultimately, I think this is kind of the problem with the museum. By focusing so narrowly on the events of the morning without giving any context, the museum actually helps to construct and reinforce one unified and political story of the trauma and chaos and fear of the day. So as I've mentioned, the context for before and after 9/11 is very, very inadequate for any kind of nuanced understanding of such a complex event. There's only passing reference made to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, almost no mention of controversial policies like the Patriot Act or the US's use of torture. Very little discussion of the rise of extremist terror around the globe, and ultimately this compromises the mission of the museum to transform visitors. While the goal is for visitors to come away with the value of human life reaffirmed, the ahistorical exhibit suggests that only some lives are valuable, the victims of 9/11 as opposed to the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of civilians who were killed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the museum tells this narrative that only one side committed violent and evil acts, the hijackers and Al-Qaeda. Taking the trauma of 9/11 out of the context in which it happened and the reality of how the US has responded to it tells a Manichaean story of good, which is of course us, the US, versus evil, them, the terrorists. And it produces a divisive and dangerous history and memory of 9/11. So rather than promoting moral transformation vis-a-vis cosmopolitan or universal ethics, the museum seems to better reflect the retreat from globalization, cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, and tolerance that we're experiencing in the US and around the world today in contemporary politics and public discourse. While the 9/11 Museum was clearly born out of a completely different ethical premise than this right-wing populism, the ahistorical but highly emotional story and memory of 9/11 that it contains seems potentially ripe for manipulation by populist and divisive forces. So rather than historical understanding, the museum creates a vivid, moving, and frightening experience of 9/11 that ends in pain and confusion and fear, with a side of redemption and the triumph of recovery and rebuilding, but no critical reflection. Although the museum appears to reflect the kind of traveling, open, transnational nature of memory, the 9/11 Museum is in fact a deeply nationalistic institution that tells a particular story of us being injured by them. And this is where your visit can potentially end in the museum with this very patriotic quilt. In constructing an ahistoric and political narrative of 9/11, the museum threatens to create a politically divisive codification of history that in many ways gives the terrorists exactly what they wanted. The spectacular terror attack has been spectacularly immortalized, and it plays out day after day, over and over again on loop. Thus, while the tropes and practices of the 9/11 Museum may reflect best practices and the transnational movements of memory, the historical memory of 9/11 created in the museum is entirely compatible with nationalist, nativist, and xenophobic rhetoric and politics.
Begin. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to the La Pietra Dialogues. It's truly an honor to participate in what is really turned out to be the continuation of this panel dialogue that Joyce Apsel began in 2015. For me, this is a part of a coming full circle peace pilgrimage, which also began in 2015 on the 70th anniversary of the birth of the nuclear age, when the first nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, today, we are less than a month away from the 50th anniversary of the My Lai Massacre, another awakening moment in the history of humanity. It is also fitting that the title of this talk is from a statement by the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. Human beings are human insofar as they bear witness to the inhuman. Agamben's statement is puzzling.
How do human beings become human when they bear witness to the inhuman, like the horrific events at Auschwitz and the other sites of atrocities, massacres, and genocides? So in this presentation, I explore what we can learn about Agamben's statement from the example of the Memorial Museum for the 1968 My Lai Massacre in the Vietnam War. The Son My Memorial and Museum is located in the Quang Ngai province in central Vietnam. It is the site of the massacre where US Army soldiers killed over 500 villagers, slaughtered their livestock, torched their homes and other buildings. So bearing witness to the inhuman means experiencing, remembering, or coming to know an event, especially one that is traumatic, deeply troubling, or involving massive violence, atrocities, assaults, mutilations, rapes, enslavements, and killings. The bearing witness process proceeds through oral sharing and dialogue, or other media such as writing, video, art, or museum exhibits. The witness bearers are those who report their firsthand experiences and memories. Of course, they include all those who were involved, the villagers, the soldiers at My Lai, and those who observed and told about the events. The visitors to the Son My Memorial, or for that matter, any memorial museum, history museum, or peace museum, are also witness bearers when they listen to and get to know the experience told through the recorded narratives, photos, videos, artifacts, and exhibits. Maybe most important, the witness bearers can be anyone, you or me, who is open to hearing and learning about the My Lai Massacre. We learn about the My Lai Massacre in the media, in history textbooks, video documentaries, in your classes, or even in talks like this. The visitor bearing witness is first impressed with the place, the ground, the land, the beautiful tropical countryside grounds where the unfathomable brutality occurred, where you can still sense the cries of those who were terrorized and killed, and where the soil, the stones, the remaining trees, and the wildlife still hold memories of the death and destruction there. In the garden, there are trees with bullet holes. Outline foundations mark where the homes and sheds stood, and each is identified with a plaque with the names and ages of the family members who lived there. Inside, the museum's narrative gives viewers many ways to come to know what happened. It is an intimate narrative, like how this clip from the 2017 Ken Burns and Lynn Novick production, The Vietnam War.
Belonging to the Americal Division and led by Captain Ernest Medina and Lieutenant William Calley, had been ordered to helicopter into the village of My Lai 4. They had been told a unit of Main Force Viet Cong was waiting for them, and they were eager for revenge. But they received no hostile fire, encountered no enemy soldiers. Instead, over the next 4 hours, Medina, Calley, and their men murdered 407 defenseless old men, women, children, and infants. Many of the women and girls were raped before they were shot. There would have been still more slaughter had a helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson Jr. not landed between the men and some of their intended targets and ordered his crew to open fire on their fellow Americans if they did not stop shooting civilians. At the same time, just a mile or so away, another company murdered 97 more villagers.
Bloggers post about what the museum informs them or informs us about their experience bearing witness. For example, this one, I was only 7 years old when the My Lai Massacre occurred, but I still remember seeing the disturbing photos of it in Life magazine. Now I'm standing at the irrigation ditch where over 100 of the bodies were found. My Lai is an emotionally tough place for anyone to visit, let alone an American. The tour guides model the bearing witness process. K.O., the guide who led my tour, walked us along this irrigation ditch where the men corralled the villagers and executed about 170. Then she stops talking. She lowers her head in a silent tribute, wiping away tears. K.O. explains to us that her own mother, who was then age 17, was taken for dead in the pile of bodies. Hugh's quiet prayer tribute was a witness-bearing ritual, not only for herself, but also for those on her tour. I am sure I am not the only one with goosebumps. To stand alongside Carol in her tribute is to connect with her and her mother. We bear witness to Carol and her mother's memory of the events occurring right there. The annual memorial service held at the Sonmi Memorial and Museum on March 16th every year is a witness-bearing ritual that contributes to societal healing, reconciliation, and international solidarity. Mike Boehm is a Vietnam veteran, now with the Madison Quakers organization, which has financially supported various My Lai projects. Boehm has returned to these services frequently to pay tribute, to award scholarships, and play music on his violin. At the 40th anniversary commemoration in 2008, former U.S. Navy officer Lawrence Coburn, who was one of the three-man helicopter crew that intervened to stop the killing, was reunited with Do Ba, a survivor he rescued. When Coburn landed his helicopter, he found 8-year-old Do Ba clinging to his mother's corpse in a ditch full of blood and bodies of more than 100 people who had been mowed down. In his testimony at the memorial service, Coburn says, "Today I see Do Ba with his wife and a baby. He's transformed himself from being a broken, lonely man. Now he's complete. He's a perfect example of the human spirit, of the will to survive." Coburn's narrative represents witness bearing to Do Ba's transformation. It is a testimony that recognizes the possibility of the restoration of dignity and the wholeness following profound trauma. Phan Thang Kong, director of the Sonmi Memorial, exemplifies how difficult the journey to healing can be, even in the witness-bearing process. Kong was 11 years old. The soldiers threw a hand grenade into the thatched roof home where Kong, his mother, and 4 siblings were huddled. Later in the afternoon, Kong was found alive amidst the corpses of his mother, his 3 sisters, and 6-year-old brother. To this day, Kong says, "I will never forget the pain." In 2008, Kong met U.S. veteran Kenneth Shield, who had participated in the massacre. Shield, who had traveled to Vietnam on a solo pilgrimage, went there to